The day everything broke began in a silence that felt heavier than any argument we had ever had, and I remember standing in the hallway watching my son Ion hold a small bag in his hand as if it carried the weight of a decision far bigger than him, and yet he stood there trying to look certain, trying to look strong, trying to look like he had already chosen a side, and I could see it in his eyes that something inside him had already shifted away from me long before this moment, and I knew without asking that his father had been slowly planting seeds in his mind, seeds of doubt, seeds of blame, seeds that grew quietly while I was busy trying to hold our life together after a divorce that had already taken so much from me, and I had spent years rebuilding myself from the ruins of that marriage, learning how to breathe again, learning how to exist without constantly questioning my worth, and through all of it Ion had been my reason to keep going, my reason to keep believing that something pure still remained in my life. But that day, as he stood in front of me with a distance in his eyes that I had never seen before, I felt something fragile begin to crack, and I asked him gently what was wrong, even though I already sensed the answer, and he looked at me with hesitation before speaking words that did not sound like his own words, that felt rehearsed, shaped, influenced by someone else, and he said, "I want to live with Dad now." And for a moment, the world seemed to stop, not in a dramatic way, not in a loud breaking way, but in a quiet sinking way, like the ground beneath me had shifted just enough to make everything feel unstable, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked him why, and he took a breath like he was preparing himself to deliver a truth he believed in, and he said, "Because you ruined everything for us, because you always make yourself the victim, because Dad says you never cared about us." And those words did not just hurt, they pierced through every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every silent tear I had ever endured for him, and I wanted to speak, I wanted to defend myself, I wanted to tell him the truth about the man he was choosing to trust, but I saw something in his expression, a wall already built too high for my words to reach, and I realized that anything I said in that moment would only make him retreat further into the version of me that he had been told to believe, and so I swallowed my pain and I simply nodded, because sometimes love is not about fighting to be heard, sometimes it is about knowing when silence is the only way to protect what little remains. And he shifted his bag on his shoulder and avoided my eyes, as if looking at me would make his decision harder, and I could see that he was struggling in his own way, even if he did not understand it yet, and I stepped aside to let him pass, because I had promised myself long ago that I would never cage him with my pain, that I would never turn his life into a battlefield just to prove a point. And as he walked past me, I felt the emptiness follow behind him like a shadow, stretching through the house and settling into every corner, and when the door closed, it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was just a simple click, but it echoed through me in a way that no shouting ever could, and I stood there for a long time staring at that closed door, as if it might open again, as if he might come back and say he had made a mistake. But deep down I knew that this was not a moment that could be undone with a single step backward. This was the result of months, maybe years, of quiet manipulation, of stories twisted just enough to make me look like the villain in a narrative I never agreed to be part of. And that night the house felt unfamiliar, like a place filled with memories that no longer belonged to me, and I walked into his room and saw the empty spaces where his things used to be, and I realized how much of my identity had been tied to being his mother in a daily, tangible way, and without that presence, everything felt uncertain. And I sat on his bed and allowed myself to cry, not the kind of crying that seeks comfort, but the kind that releases something buried deep inside, something that had been building long before this day. And as the tears fell, I began to understand something painful but necessary, that I had lost more than a marriage. I had lost the trust of my own child to a version of reality that I could not control, and in that moment I faced a choice. I could chase him, I could fight to pull him back, I could exhaust myself trying to undo the damage that had already been done, or I could step back and allow time to reveal the truth in a way that no argument ever could. And it was not an easy choice. It was not a choice that felt right in my heart, but it was the only one that made sense, because love forced into someone who does not recognize it becomes something else, something suffocating, something that pushes them further away. And I refused to become that version of a mother, and so I made a quiet promise to myself that night, a promise that I would not beg for a place in his life that I had already earned 3 years of unconditional love, a promise that I would rebuild myself once again. Not for him, not for anyone else, but for me, because I had learned the hard way that when your sense of worth depends entirely on how others see you, it becomes fragile, easily broken by their misunderstandings and their choices. And I knew that if I wanted to survive this, if I wanted to remain whole in a situation designed to break me, I had to become stronger than the narrative being written about me. And so I wiped my tears and stood up from his bed and looked around the room one last time, not as a place of loss, but as a reminder of what I had given, what I had been, what I still was, regardless of what anyone else believed. And as I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, I felt a quiet shift inside. Me not healing, not yet, but the beginning of something else. Something steady, something determined, something that would carry me forward even in the absence of the one person I had built my world around. And that was the day everything broke, but it was also the day something new began to form within me, something that would one day become my strength, even if I could not see it yet. The rise no one expected began in the silence of a house that had once been filled with laughter and now echoed only with the sounds of my own footsteps and the quiet hum of appliances running in the background as I moved from room to room, trying to imagine how I could rebuild a life that felt half empty and yet still full of potential. I began with the smallest things, waking up early each morning, forcing myself to leave the comfort of grief behind and step into the world that still demanded my presence. I focused on work first, the bills, the responsibilities, the errands that kept the wheels turning. But slowly, I allowed myself to dream again, to imagine a life not dictated by the mistakes of my past or the manipulation that had stolen my son from me. I poured energy into myself, learning skills I had neglected. I took courses I had never dared to try. I spoke to people I had avoided. I networked and connected, and little by little doors opened that I had not even known existed. I started a small business, something I had always wanted but had put aside during my marriage, and in the quiet of late nights after work I devoted myself to it fully. Each project, each challenge, each setback became a teacher, and every small success became a proof that I was capable of more than I had believed. And I noticed something unexpected as I grew stronger, as I built confidence, as I began to walk taller in the world. I started to feel a sense of power, not the power that crushes others, but the power that rises from knowing that you can survive anything, and that strength became my armor against the lingering hurt of losing Ion to his father. And yet, even as I built myself, I could not ignore the stories that reached me about my son, about how his father had promised him freedom and excitement, how the gadgets, the privileges, the adventures all seemed thrilling at first, but how slowly the rules that had been absent began to turn into control, how the promises turned into obligations, how my ex revealed the cracks in the picture he had painted for Ion. And I resisted the urge to intervene, to reach out, to call, to remind Ion of the love he once had, because I knew that my revenge was not in confrontation, it was in silence, it was in becoming someone unshakable, someone whose existence proved that I could thrive even when the world tried to tear me down. I wanted him to see the truth, not through my words, but through the reality he would eventually face on his own. And as the months passed, I noticed changes within myself, a resilience that was no longer fragile, a confidence that no longer wavered with each insult or accusation that had once haunted me. I found joy in work, I found pride in achievements, I found peace in quiet moments alone where I could reflect without judgment. And I started to surround myself with people who supported and inspired me, not people who reminded me of loss and betrayal. And slowly the emptiness that had once threatened to swallow me began to shrink, replaced by a sense of purpose and direction. I took long walks in the evenings, imagining a future where I was whole, where I was independent, where I was not waiting for validation from anyone. And in that vision I began planning steps not just for survival but for flourishing. I invested in my appearance, my health, my home. I redecorated rooms as a symbolic act of reclaiming my space, and every small choice, every deliberate action became a declaration that I was no longer the person my ex had tried to diminish. And at night, when the world was quiet, I sometimes thought of Ion and the choices he had made, and though a part of me ached, a part of me also understood that his journey was his own, and that my role was no longer to chase, but to build, so that one day when he returned he would find a woman stronger, wiser, unbroken, and waiting not with anger but with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived and thrived despite the betrayals of the past. And that realization became a strange comfort, a source of energy that fueled me through difficult days, through lonely nights, through moments of doubt. And slowly the work bore fruit, not in a dramatic overnight transformation, but in subtle shifts in confidence, in the way people treated me, in the opportunities that began to appear in my business, in the pride I felt in small victories that cumulatively rebuilt my sense of self. And I started documenting plans, setting goals, pushing limits, testing boundaries, allowing myself to imagine a life bigger than I had dared to dream before. And it was during this time that I discovered something else, a truth about revenge that I had not considered before. It was not in the humiliation of others, not in the exposure of lies, not in the victory over my ex. It was in the quiet, undeniable evidence that I could survive the worst and still create a life of beauty and strength that no one could take away. And in realizing that, I felt a weight lift from my chest, a weight I had carried since the day Ion left. And I understood that my growth was my message, my power, my revenge in the purest sense. And as the seasons changed, I Watched myself evolve from a woman defined by loss to a woman defined by action and purpose, and in those long nights when I worked tirelessly on my business, when I pushed myself beyond comfort, when I forced myself to confront fear and doubt, I knew that I was becoming someone who no longer needed approval or validation, because my worth was evident in my own persistence and my own courage and my own determination. And as I stood in my home looking around at the life I had carved from pain and perseverance, I realized that the journey was far from over, that there would always be moments that tested me, that reminded me of absence and loss, but now I faced them with tools I had forged through struggle and reflection. And I felt a sense of pride in knowing that if Ion ever returned, he would find not a woman broken by betrayal, but a woman who had used the deepest wounds to rise higher than anyone expected. And that awareness gave me a thrill, a quiet satisfaction, the kind that does not boast, but that carries in it the weight of victory earned through resilience and determination. And so I continued building each day, moving forward step by step, project by project, victory by victory, learning patience, learning strategy, learning that the sweetest form of revenge is not the destruction of others, but the creation of yourself as someone unassailable, someone steady, someone undeniably whole. And by the end of that year, I could look back and see the distance I had traveled, the transformation that had taken place, the inner strength that had grown in ways I had never imagined, and I understood fully for the first time that my life had shifted from survival to thriving, and that nothing could undo the foundation I had rebuilt. And in that quiet realization I smiled, knowing that the day would come when the past would knock on my door again, but this time I would be ready, not with anger, not with pleading, but with the unwavering calm of a woman who had conquered her own fears and risen above betrayal. And through it all I learned that the greatest triumph is not in making others pay, it is in refusing to be diminished by them and becoming everything they doubted you could be. And that became my story, my rise, my quiet, unstoppable victory, the rise no one expected. The return of regret began on a quiet evening that felt ordinary at first, but carried the weight of inevitability. I had settled into a rhythm of life rebuilt from the pieces left behind after my son Ion had walked away, and while the house was no longer empty, my heart still bore the memory of his absence. And that night when there was a knock at the door, a simple sound that could have been anyone, I felt an unexpected tightening in my chest, and as I opened the door I saw him standing there, a figure I had imagined countless times yet never expected to see. In reality he looked older than the boy who had left me. He looked heavier, as if the burden of his own choices had settled on his shoulders, and I noticed in his eyes the mix of hesitation and longing, the uncertainty of someone who had lived with partial truths for too long. And when he whispered "Mom," it was barely audible, yet it carried a lifetime of unspoken emotions, guilt, regret, confusion, and an aching need for connection. And I stepped aside, letting him in without asking questions, because I knew that the moment required presence, not interrogation. He walked slowly through the house, taking in the familiar surroundings that now felt foreign to him, searching perhaps for a memory of feeling a place where he once belonged. And we sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words because it held years of distance and pain. And finally he began to speak, apologizing, stumbling over the words as he tried to explain the choices he had made under the influence of his father and the promises and manipulations that had shaped his perception of me. And he described the gradual disillusionment with the life he had chosen, how the excitement had turned into pressure, how freedom had become expectation, how love had turned into judgment. And as he spoke I listened quietly, not interrupting, not correcting, because the truth he was realizing was something he needed to confront on his own. And I saw the weight lift slightly from his shoulders as he acknowledged the mistakes and misunderstandings, the realization that I had never stopped loving him even when he walked away. And when he finally asked, "Can I come home?" the words hung in the air, fragile and tentative, carrying the vulnerability of someone seeking forgiveness and a second chance. And in that moment I understood that this was not a moment for anger, for recrimination, for reminders of hurt. This was a moment for compassion, for patience, for allowing the space for healing to begin. And I told him, "You can come home, but things will not be the same, not because I do not love you, but because we have both changed, because trust is not rebuilt instantly, it is nurtured carefully, moment by moment." And he nodded, understanding that returning was not a reset, it was the beginning of a journey together, a journey where we would have to navigate emotions long neglected and bridges long burned. And as he slowly began to settle into the house, the weight of silence began to lift, replaced by tentative conversation, by shared meals, by small gestures that spoke louder than apologies. And in those early days I watched him struggle with guilt and shame. I watched him wrestle with the realization of how easily he had been influenced, and I watched him start to take steps toward understanding, not just of me but of himself. And I realized that my role was no longer to punish or lecture, but to provide a space where truth could be faced, where mistakes could be acknowledged, and where love could be experienced without conditions or hidden agendas, and while the past could never be erased, it could be reframed as a learning experience, a painful but necessary step toward maturity. And I also noticed how his father's influence had left deep impressions that could not be undone with words alone, how the trust that was broken could only be restored through actions, through consistency, through the demonstration that love persists even when mistakes are made. And as we navigated these first days together, there were moments of silence, moments of tension, moments where the past seemed poised to reclaim its hold, but I remained steady, modeling patience and calmness, and gradually he began to respond, matching the tone of careful sincerity with his own attempts to rebuild connection. And there were nights when we sat together talking about memories, laughing quietly at moments of shared joy that had never really left us, and I saw glimpses of the boy he once was, the son I had always loved, the child who had not yet fully been lost to manipulation. And I also saw the young man he was becoming, someone capable of reflection, someone willing to acknowledge wrongdoing, someone ready to begin again. And in that space I felt a mixture of relief and sadness, relief that he had returned, and sadness for all that had been lost along the way. And I knew that the journey would not be linear, that there would be setbacks, moments of anger, moments of doubt, but I also knew that we were stronger for having faced the distance, and that each small step forward was a triumph in itself. And I watched as he began to reclaim his place, not as a means to erase the past, but as a testament to resilience, to the enduring bond between mother and son. And I allowed myself to hope again, continuously, with an awareness that healing takes time, that trust must be nurtured, and that love is not a given, it is a gift, repeatedly offered and accepted. And in offering my acceptance without judgment, I discovered my own strength, the capacity to forgive, not for him but for myself, the capacity to love not conditionally but fully. And I realized that in allowing him to return, I was not conceding power. I was exercising it by creating a framework where honesty, accountability, and compassion could coexist. And I saw the beginnings of our life together slowly taking shape, routines being reestablished, traditions revisited, small moments of comfort and connection being built like bricks, one by one. And I also saw in Ion a willingness to engage, a curiosity to understand his own feelings, his own choices, his own mistakes. And that willingness became a bridge for us both, a way to reconnect, not as the same people we were before, but as evolved versions of ourselves, with the capacity to acknowledge pain and yet choose love. And I recognized that this was the essence of what I had sought all along, not revenge, not retribution, but the restoration of a bond tested by manipulation and absence. And the knowledge that he had come back of his own volition added a weight of authenticity to our reconnection that no argument or explanation could have achieved. And in those first weeks of his return, I watched him slowly shed the burden of misplaced loyalty, the illusions that had kept him at a distance, and I watched him begin to trust, not blindly but cautiously, grounded in the reality of our renewed relationship. And I realized that the most profound transformation was not just his return, but the growth it inspired in me, the patience, the empathy, the resilience to allow healing to unfold naturally. And in this quiet evolution, we began to share space again, learning to coexist, learning to communicate, learning to forgive, and we began to discover moments of joy that had been absent for years, moments of laughter, moments of understanding, moments of shared silence that spoke volumes. And as I looked at him, I could see both the son I had always loved and the young man he was becoming, and I felt a complex mixture of emotions, relief, pride, sorrow, love, and hope intertwined in a way that reminded me of the depth of human experience. And I knew that the path ahead would be challenging, that there would be moments of doubt, that the past would attempt to reclaim influence, and that mistakes would be made. But I also knew that we had begun a journey of reclamation that nothing could erase. And in that understanding, I found a profound peace, the kind that comes from recognizing that pain can lead to growth, that absence can lead to appreciation, that mistakes can lead to understanding, and that the return of someone lost is not merely an event, it is a process of reconciliation with oneself and others. And as we continued to navigate our new reality together, the foundation of patience and honesty began to strengthen the bond between us, slowly, firmly, authentically. And I realized that the greatest lesson of his return was that true connection requires vulnerability, courage, empathy, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths, and that in embracing these principles we could rebuild a relationship not as it once was, but as something stronger, more resilient, and deeply rooted in mutual respect and love. And in that realization, I smiled quietly, knowing that the day Ion returned marked not just the restoration of our relationship, but the beginning of a chapter defined by understanding, growth, and the enduring power of love. The sweetest revenge began on a morning when sunlight spilled softly across the floors of my home, and I watched Ion move through the spaces of a house he had once abandoned. And in that moment I realized how much we had both changed, how much time and experience had shaped us into people who carried scars but also strength, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, not of triumph over someone else but of triumph over my own pain and the years of struggle that had once threatened to consume me. And I knew that the revenge I had sought in the past was not the kind that destroys or humiliates. It was the kind that comes quietly, steadily, unassailably, the kind that proves to the world that you can endure, you can rebuild, you can rise above betrayal and manipulation without losing your soul. And I looked at my son not as someone who had left me in anger or confusion, but as someone who had been lost and now was finding his way back. And I felt love in its purest form, a love that forgives, a love that nurtures, a love that chooses patience over punishment. And I told him, you can come home, but things will not be the same, not because I do not love you, but because we have both grown and healing takes time. And he nodded, understanding that the return was not a return to the past, but a step toward a new chapter where trust would be rebuilt moment by moment, where mistakes would be acknowledged without shame, where love would be expressed not as a condition but as a constant. And as the days turned into weeks, I watched Ion begin to rediscover his place in our home, learning to navigate the boundaries that had been set, learning to listen, learning to reflect, learning to engage with empathy and responsibility. And I watched myself respond with patience, with guidance, with quiet encouragement, without forcing him or imposing my expectations. And slowly the distance that had once seemed insurmountable began to shrink, replaced by shared moments of connection, meals together, conversations that flowed without tension, laughter that filled the spaces once empty. And in these moments, I recognized the power of resilience, the way it allows people to return from absence, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. And I saw in Ion a maturity emerging, a recognition of past mistakes, a willingness to embrace accountability, and a desire to be part of a relationship that valued honesty and trust above all else. And as he began to take these steps, I felt my own heart heal further, because I realized that the sweetest revenge is not in causing suffering to those who have wronged you or in proving yourself to them. It is in becoming someone unshakable, someone who thrives despite the betrayals and manipulations, someone whose life cannot be diminished by the actions of others. And in that understanding, I felt a serenity I had never known, a freedom that comes from releasing the need to control others and focusing on creating a life that is strong and whole. And I began to enjoy the ordinary moments, the simple routines, the quiet companionship of having my son back in my life. And I saw how the absence had made our connection more precious, how the return had deepened our bond, how forgiveness could be given without forgetting, and how love could persist even when trust had been fractured. And each day we spent together became a testament to endurance, to courage, to the human capacity for change and growth. And I began to embrace a life that no longer revolved around past hurts or lingering resentment, but around the deliberate choice to build a future that was ours to define. And in watching Ion laugh freely again, I realized that my revenge had been achieved not in confrontation but in the undeniable proof of my resilience, and in showing him through my actions, not my words, that I had survived, that I had rebuilt, that I had become stronger than the circumstances that had once broken me. And as he began to confide in me in small ways, sharing thoughts, dreams, fears, and aspirations, I felt a sense of completeness return to our home, a warmth that had been absent for far too long. And I recognized that our relationship was no longer a battle of blame, but a partnership of mutual respect, where honesty could flourish and love could thrive without fear of manipulation or control. And the awareness that my ex, who had once sought to diminish me, had no hold over our lives anymore, brought an additional sense of peace, a quiet victory that required no celebration, because its power lay in its subtlety, in the fact that it could not be undone by words or actions, but only respected and acknowledged. And as the weeks turned into months, I saw transformation not just in Ion but in myself. I became more patient, more understanding, more capable of seeing the complexities of human behavior without judgment. I became a model of strength and compassion simultaneously, and this combination created a foundation on which our renewed relationship could stand firmly against any future challenge. And I taught him by example that resilience does not mean hardness, it does not mean coldness, it means enduring pain with grace, it means confronting mistakes with courage, it means loving despite fear. And I watched him internalize these lessons, slowly, steadily, learning to trust the world and trust me again in ways that were authentic and lasting. And in seeing him grow, I felt a sense of fulfillment that surpassed any desire for revenge, because I understood that true victory is measured not by the suffering of others but by the wholeness of your own life and the integrity with which you face your challenges. And I realized that the sweetest revenge is not about winning against someone else, it is about winning for yourself, about proving to the world and to yourself that you cannot be broken, that You can rise above betrayal and neglect, and in this realization I felt a profound satisfaction, the kind that radiates quietly from within, that requires no announcement, no demonstration, no applause. It is simply known through presence, through action, through the way you carry yourself. And I began to savor the ordinary joys of life, the routines, the shared meals, the laughter, the conversations, the quiet moments together, because they were no longer taken for granted, because they had been threatened, and now they were reclaimed. And in that reclamation I found power and patience, power and perseverance, power and love, and I saw how each day of nurturing, rebuilding, reconnecting was a brick in the foundation of our renewed bond, and I recognized that the process itself was as important as the outcome, because it taught lessons that instant gratification never could. It taught humility, it taught empathy, it taught the value of steady, consistent effort, and I understood that by allowing Ion to come home and by responding with patience and strength, I was showing him the true meaning of love and family, not as something earned through fear or control, but as something cultivated through presence, respect, and unwavering care. And in these moments I felt a quiet triumph that no one could take away, a victory that had nothing to do with retribution and everything to do with growth and healing. And I began to see our life together as a series of steps forward, each one reinforcing the last, creating momentum, creating stability, creating a legacy of resilience and compassion that could endure any future challenge. And as I watched Ion settle into his renewed life with cautious joy, I understood that the sweetest revenge was complete, not in any act of spite, but in the undeniable proof of survival and strength and love that could not be shaken by betrayal or absence. And I knew finally that in rising above the pain and choosing patience and embracing forgiveness and building a life of purpose and strength, I had achieved the kind of victory that lasts a lifetime, the kind of revenge that is not hollow but full, the kind of satisfaction that comes from being whole and unbreakable. And in this understanding, I felt peace and pride intertwined, a sense of completion, not in erasing the past, but in transforming it into a foundation upon which a new chapter could flourish for both my son and myself. And as I looked at him and smiled, I realized that the journey we had undertaken together was only the beginning of a life defined not by what we had lost, but by the resilience, love, and strength we had reclaimed and created anew.